Hello, everyone. My name is Lisa Anderson. I'm a clinical nutritionist, and I work a lot with the special needs community. So let me just see if I can share my screen. Okay, is everybody seeing that?
We don't see it yet.
Okay. Oops, let's go back. Okay. I see it. How do I?
In the Zoom window, if you go to the bottom, you'll see a share screen button.
Okay. Yep.
And you click that and then select your slideshow.
Share. There we go.
It looks good. See it now.
Okay, let me just clear my screen so I see it too. Oops, let's go back. Okay, I loved seeing the photos of your beautiful children because I too am a special needs mom, and I can relate to probably a lot of some of the things that you've been going through and the struggles and the joys, and especially around nutrition. So I'm here to talk to you about over the next little bit about what happens when your child just doesn't seem to tolerate anything and how to overcome digestive distress with blenderized tube feeding. So as I said, my name is Lisa Anderson. I'm a clinical nutritionist focusing on the special needs community and digestive issues. And my daughter, I want to introduce you to her. Her name is Clara, and she had a really tough beginning. So on the left, you see her as a newborn. She spent 16 months at Sick Kids Hospital in Toronto. And basically, there's probably very little that we didn't experience. So she needed to be ventilated by mouth. She couldn't swallow. She couldn't breathe through her nose. She had an NG tube put in. Oh, no, yeah. So you can't really see the NG tube. You see the tape on her face. She had IVs in her head and her feet and all over. And basically life became extremely difficult for her and for us. And then, jump forward 19 years, and there she is at the cottage last summer. And there's a huge difference. So how in the world did this happen? And I can honestly say it was not by fluke. So there she is again, on the left as a baby. She was 6 months old there. She had only gained about 2 pounds in 6 months. She now has a tracheostomy, and she has a G tube, a PEG tube. So you can see it with the little red cap at the bottom left corner there. And then again, jump forward to this current year to a blenderized diet. And there she is eating her blended food, and she can feed herself with just syringes into her G tube. So how in the world did this happen? So what happens when your child can't swallow, and what options do you have? So first of all, if the digestive tract is not working at all, we have parenteral nutrition, in which food could go into the body through IV. And that's really the only option if the digestive tract isn't working at all. We also have enteral nutrition if the digestive tract is working, and Dr. Goldman explained a lot about that this morning and the options that exist. And so if your child can't swallow or chew properly, then the options at first seem limited, but they're probably not as limited as you expect. So enteral feeding really began like about 3,500 years ago with the Greeks and the Egyptians trying to feed people who couldn't eat by mouth or chew properly or swallow. And what they actually did was they stuck a tube up the rectum and provided some nutrition that way. So we've come a long way. A lot of companies now create hundreds of different types of formula, and there's some pictures here of some of them that exist. And so did that solve everything? No. So my daughter started off with, after my breast milk was done, she started off with a soy-based formula And over time, at the beginning, it seemed fine, but over time, she developed a sensitivity to the soy, in fact, probably an allergy, and had some breathing problems. And I was scrambling to try and figure out what in the world do I feed her? We were up at the cottage. I didn't have a lot of food on hand, and we were basically had her formula. So we ended up blending, I blended, I think, oatmeal and some water and probably a few vegetables, and she was able to tolerate it, thankfully. So I started thinking, okay, what else can I do? She had horrible, horrible digestive distress as once she started on this formula, well, basically anytime she was eating. So some of the issues that can occur are aspiration. And again, Dr. Goldman went through some of this. Reflux is common, and I understand it's quite common with CDD as well. Digestive distress is a global term I use for things like the reflux, the aspiration, the diarrhea, constipation, vomiting, excess mucus. Sometimes it can be a skin rash or not feeling well, like immediately after eating, gut or stomach pain, or sometimes several hours after eating, there can still be some gut pain there. So I sort of lump all those in together and call them digestive distress. So there are lots of different formulas, as I said, that cover any sort of diet, but they don't necessarily help every child. And so often the digestive distress can continue. And so then you're left trying to wonder what you're going to do next. So then you can start to consider blenderized diets or blenderized tube feeding. And that's my daughter, Clara, with her tube food. And so tube food's another name for it. And what blenderized diets to me has become, it's a meal that has been pureed that contains the 3 macronutrients: carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. In this case, it actually differs from a smoothie, because a smoothie can be blended. Sometimes it might have some protein powder in it and some healthy fats, but not necessarily. It might just be some fruit or vegetables, and could be yogurt and even ice cream, and can go into a smoothie. So it really, sometimes a smoothie can be a blenderized diet, but not every smoothie is a blenderized diet. So it's also an opportunity to provide the most nutrient-dense foods to someone who cannot chew food. So I work with a lot of patients from around the world on creating blenderized diets, and they often come to me because they have tried literally everything and nothing seems to be working for them. They've tried various different formulas, they've tried blending food, they've tried different recipes, and sometimes it's the combination of ingredients that they are using that actually can make a difference. So I'll get into this in a little bit, but I basically explain to parents, you want to provide, especially if there's a lot of digestive distress, it's a sign that the gut needs to heal. And you want to give your child the opportunity to have the most nutrient dense foods that they can. And so a tube or blenderized diets can be given via mouth or through a feeding tube. I've worked with clients who have wanted to drink it, which is fine. Again, it can be like a smoothie. And it can be given through feeding tube. It can, and again, the different types of tubes, the NG, the G, the J, and the NJ. It can be easier to give it through a G tube. With a J tube, sometimes you have to be careful of some of the ingredients, and you need to understand how digestion works and what foods can be digested well if they're going directly into the J tube. And an NG and an NJ can work. Those tubes tend to be a little smaller, so you have to be careful that you're not going to clog the tube. And so all recipes can be created for any tube. It's just a matter of tweaking certain ingredients and trying to figure out what's going to work for your child and the tube. And it's usually for ages 1 through seniors. And I qualify that only because many doctors and dietitians don't recommend tube feeding below the 1-year mark, just because babies have a lot of sensitivities and cannot tolerate foods. Their digestive tract hasn't fully developed yet. But I want to qualify that further and say it doesn't mean that blenderized diets have not been tried with those under the age of 1, and they have been successful. You just have to be very careful. And I would highly recommend working with someone that's open to creating a blend that's going to work well with your child. So why make a blenderized diet? So there are advantages and disadvantages. In my opinion, the advantages outweigh the disadvantages. So let's go through some of them. So first of all, nutrition is coming from whole foods. And as I said, as I've already explained, I think if the digestive tract is really inflamed and there's a lot of digestive distress, real nutrient-dense real foods is the way to go. And that I've seen, I don't think I've ever seen real foods make digestion worse for any child I've worked with. Most of the time, there's some improvement, if not a lot of improvement. With a blenderized diet, you can customize calories, you can customize the ingredients you're using, and you can customize the amount of food that's being given. I usually find when parents come to me that the dietitian has trained them very well into making sure their child is getting this amount of calories at this rate and this volume. And so sometimes that has to be put aside, or sometimes we can create the blend to sort of meet those requirements. Usually calories can be counted to make sure the child is getting the calories, or sometimes a blend can be started without. When I started, I didn't count calories at all for my daughter. I was basically guessing and to see what would work. I made a lot of mistakes, but I also figured out a lot of things that now I am able to pass on to my clients to save them the time that it took me to figure it out. It can be varied like an oral diet. It can be taken by mouth or via feeding tube. So again, if it's going to be taken by mouth, it can be thick, can be thin, it can be drunk, it can be spoon-fed, but it needs to taste good. So I find if it's going to, sometimes if it's going to be done orally, adding some specific herbs and spices can make it taste better. There's a handful of different ingredients that can be added to that really do help, that you wouldn't necessarily put in if it's going to be blended. And sometimes those can be too, but it is possible to make it taste good. And sometimes you might make different blends. I usually recommend, if a parent's starting out, especially if it's going to be tube fed, just make one blend. I have a lot of ambitious parents who want to say, I want to make a breakfast blend, I want to make a lunch and a dinner. You know, you got to do what you think is best for your child and given your time constraints, what are you going to be able to manage? But sometimes blending something that tastes good is easier when there's fewer ingredients in it. A blended diet can reduce and even relieve digestive distress. There have been many cases of improved feeding tolerance, a reduction in constipation, diarrhea, gagging, and retching, all those digestive distress symptoms. It can fit any type of diet, keto, and I know that a lot of CDD kids are on the keto diet, or low carb, paleo, specific carbohydrate diet, or SCD, low protein, low carb, low FODMAPs, the specific SIBO diet. SIBO is small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. So sometimes there can be a buildup of bacteria in the gut that can be affecting what's happening, diarrhea, constipation, and some of those other digestive distress symptoms. And so sometimes it's not necessarily what they're eating, but what else is going on in the gut. It can help to eliminate hard to digest foods and chemicals that are not tolerated. So a lot of formulas, unless they're one of the newer food-based formulas, are created in a laboratory, and they often use synthetic, cheap nutrients, and that are very hard to digest. So with a blended diet, often food is easier to digest. I'm a firm believer that our bodies were made for real food, and that with some tweaking and some gut healing, most, if not all people can find some food that they're able to tolerate. Sometimes it can be one step forward and a few steps back, which I'll get into, but I think overall the trajectory is usually improved digestive health with a blenderized diet. And as I mentioned already, often one blend can be used for all the meals, which can save time. So let's talk about some of the disadvantages. It can be time consuming, especially initially. So when a parent wants to start a blenderized diet, I usually recommend starting with a few foods that are usually anti-inflammatory and easy to digest. And let's see how the child is with that. So sometimes, as I said, the child can tolerate it, but sometimes they can't. And so you're fiddling around, figuring out and troubleshooting what's going to work, what's not working, and then creating what I call a baseline blend, which I'll talk about in a bit. Sometimes when starting a blenderized diet, the child isn't getting enough calories or nutrients just because you're starting out with a very limited amount of food. But there's always ways of increasing calories if fat is tolerated, especially if they are on a keto diet and they can tolerate high amounts of fat and low carb. It's very easy to blend a diet using fats because they do not take up a lot of volume. And that's where most of these blends get their calories from. You want vegetables in there because they provide the nutrients, but they're not necessarily high cal. So children often can lose weight initially, which sometimes will scare parents or the dietitian or the doctor. Sometimes I've found too that a child may be a good weight with a fair amount of body fat, but sometimes the child does lose weight and sort of the balance is out. So some ways to determine if your child is tolerating the food or a blend is often the digestive distress will stop. If you start a blended diet and the digestive distress just continues and there's something going on, we'll talk a bit about that too. So you don't want to just continue and assume that it's working if you don't see a change in some of the symptoms that the child's been experiencing. But sometimes the child's weight balances out, and you can tell that there's usually less digestive distress. They are able to tolerate. They're just able to tolerate things. There's less, as I said, less digestive distress, and they're pooping well, and those symptoms are gone. So I've had people come to me who have had lots of diarrhea or constipation, and suddenly they're tolerating, they're not gagging, they're not retching, and they're starting to poop. And it's not watery, it's like a nice, decent poop. And that's a good sign that something's working well. So sometimes the blend can be made too thick, and actually that's a very common cause. And it can, if it's thick, it's easier to push in via a syringe, but sometimes people will water it down, and then the child isn't getting the full blend for that day because they're volume sensitive and they're rate sensitive. So I find there's always tricks to the trade. So one of the things that you can do if that happens is freeze it. And usually a day or two in the freezer will denature the proteins, and make the blend a lot more watery. So if you think about a frozen bag of green beans, when they're frozen, they're quite firm. And when you take them out of the freezer and you let it sit, you find that they're quite mushy once they're thawed, and there's a bunch of water sitting in the bag as well. So what's happened with the freezing is those proteins in the green beans have been denatured, and yes, vegetables have proteins in them too. And so those cell walls have broken and spilled out their contents, which is basically the water you see in that bag, and it becomes a lot mushy. So the same thing happens with a blended diet. If you've got a container of food, you can stick it in the freezer and it becomes kind of more mushy, even though it's all blended. and it's easier to put through a feeding tube or even use with a pump if that's the case. So there's some rumors that a blend can be contaminated with microorganisms, and this is quite common. So I have put this to the test. So as I said, I've been blending for my daughter for about 19 years, and not once has she had food poisoning. And all her food has been made basically by me or people who have helped me make it. I have left her food in a container in the fridge for over 2 weeks, and I've tried feeding it to her, and she still didn't get sick. And we use meat and vegetables and healthy fats. Not once has she gotten sick. So I think that's a pretty good track record. I do not sanitize. I do not sterilize. I just wash by hand or by dishwasher all the tools that are needed to make it, and don't have any problems. With it, when making a blended diet, it's unusual to calculate the blended meals according to kilocalories per milliliter, and that's what formulas are often calculate. So sometimes it can be a bit challenging working with medical staff, but it is possible to calculate that if it's really needed. And if not well blended, a tube can clog. And there are tricks to unclogging a tube. And the better the blender you use, the more likely that it will not clog. So what blenderized diet should contain? So as I mentioned already, all 3 macronutrients, carbs, protein, and fat. If it's eaten by mouth, the blend should taste good. And so herbs and spices are usually recommended, and sometimes other things. Any flavorings I use are always natural and healthy and suitable for the child or the person I'm making it for. They should contain all the essential micronutrients and as many non-essential nutrients as possible. So when I say essential, it means that the body cannot produce it on its own. A human must get the nutrient via diet or through supplementation. So omega-3 and 6 fatty acids, ideally best from fish, because the DHA and the EPA in the omega-3 does not need to be converted in the body. So if you're not eating fish, then certainly omega-3 or fish oil or algal oil if vegetarian. I would not heat that oil if using it. I would put it just through syringe into the feeding tube. And they make these that taste really good now. So even if your child is eating by mouth, they can benefit from that. And basically all of us should be ensuring that we're getting our omega-3. Omega-6, if you're using any sort of processed food or packaged food, usually contains omega-6 fatty acids already. So not usually necessary to supplement with those. There are 9 essential amino acids. Amino acids come from protein. And so if the blend contains usually chicken or fish is what I recommend starting with, then all those amino acids will be present. If you're a vegetarian, then you have to combine vegetable sources. And I can basically say, really work with someone to make sure that those are tolerated and in the diet in order to make sure that your child is getting them all and is able to tolerate them all. It's not causing any additional inflammation or anything. Vitamins A, B, C, E, K, and sometimes D. Sometimes D, it can be synthesized in the body from sunlight and certain sources like some fish oils, and fish and eggs will contain some levels of vitamin D. If the body is able to convert it, that's great. So including ensuring you're getting foods and or supplements containing those nutrients, those vitamins, and the following minerals is really important. So sodium, iron, potassium, calcium, chloride, magnesium, phosphorus, and trace minerals. And I put water here because it is essential. We don't produce it, so we must get enough of it. And water is important for gut health and for a blended diet. So how to start a blended diet. There's an example right here in the photo. You do need a powerful blender. I recommend a Vitamix and Blendtec. These are expensive blenders, but the companies usually, if they know that somebody needs it for needs to blend their food to get the proper nutrition, they often offer discounts or refurbished models at a discount. You need a recipe that's going to work for your child, and those are available at different places through your doctor, nutritionist, dietitian. There are books that provide them as well. You need the ingredients purchased and prepped. You need some storage containers, and you need some time. And so the process is basically this. I have some parents, and I am in a lot of Facebook groups, and often people will say, just blend the family dinner. And often, because if your child or the person it's for has digestive distress, their gut needs to be healed, and blending the family dinner won't necessarily help. It may, and sometimes it seems initially that it does, and then sometimes the food sensitivities will start to show. So just watch for that. You want to start with easy to digest anti-inflammatory ingredients. You want to ensure the recipe includes all the macronutrients. And this is a simple blend that can be started with pretty much with anybody. A homemade chicken broth, the chicken and carrot from the broth, the fat from the broth, or some coconut oil, and steamed leafy greens if over a year old. If under or around the 1 year mark and they're having a lot of bloating, I would use something else instead of leafy greens, just because very young children have a hard time digesting that. And then once tolerated, you can increase the ingredients one by one. And if that simple blend is well tolerated, then I call that the baseline blend. And so these are just some photos of blends and the process. These are the containers. My daughter eats 4 cups of blend at a meal now. But I started just putting blended food into breast milk bags and freezing those. So there's lots of different options. Some people use mason jars. The picture on the right are a bunch of different blended diets I created for a woman, a senior, who would drink it. And so they were various different flavors and ingredients used, and they all tasted really good. Okay, so what happens, just troubleshooting some digestive distress issues. So what happens if your child has reflux, gagging, retching, vomiting, or gas after you start a blenderized diet, or even before you start the diet? So this is often a sign that there's something going on with the stomach. They may not be tolerating something in their blend or in their diet. Some potential causes, and I put some of the sources here, can be low stomach acid, malabsorption of carbohydrates or protein. It can be related to bacterial overgrowth, or like something like small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, or SIBO. You want to remember that there are various different organs that affect how we digest, absorb, and eliminate. And so the mouth, if they're going to be eating by mouth at all, the stomach, intestines, liver, gallbladder, pancreas are all involved in the creation of enzymes, digestive enzymes, and in digestion and absorption of our food, regardless how it's eaten. So if these organs are not working optimally, then you want to make sure that's happening, and working with someone who can help you with that is really paramount. So if your child or the person has pain or discomfort shortly after eating, it's usually a sign that there's something stomach related going on. And again, the liver and the gallbladder and the pancreas can all kind of feed into that as well. If there's pain or discomfort several hours after eating, it's usually a sign there's an intestinal issue going on. So you want to consider some things you can consider are low carb diet, digestive enzymes, and certainly gut healing. Next one is if there's diarrhea, it's usually related to transit time being too fast. A meal is digested usually between 17 and 24 hours. And diarrhea usually means the transit time is really too fast. So you want to think about, is there something in the diet that they're not able to digest properly? Is there a food intolerance? And often signs of food intolerance can be vomiting, diarrhea, bloody stool, sometimes like skin condition like eczema, failure to thrive, and other symptoms. Intolerance to dairy is the most common, probably. It can also happen with histamine intolerance and intolerances to other things like fructose, fructans, and FODMAPs. FODMAPs are the fermentable oligosaccharides, disaccharides, monosaccharides, and polyols that are contained in our foods, mostly in our carbohydrates. So often limiting carbohydrates or a keto diet is beneficial for for many kids, for CDD, and lots of other kids with special needs can find certain type of carbohydrates very difficult to digest properly. So some options are enzymes, additional fiber, and I really caution with that because sometimes too much fiber can be problematic. Some sort of special diet, going on an elimination diet, trying to figure out what the cause is. Going back to baseline, which is going back to something that you know is well tolerated, trying out low FODMAPs, low histamine, and the specific carbohydrate diet. And constipation. So constipation is huge, and I know I'm getting to the end of my time, and this is a huge, huge, huge issue for CDD and for many, many people. So depending when it started, if it starts as a young infant, you really do want to rule out physiological causes for it and make sure those are treated if there is one. Following that, and even if there's a physiological cause, you want to get the child pooping every day. That's important so that toxins aren't circulating through the body. And working with many children, I find that magnesium and vitamin C supplementation, increasing healthy fats, and I can, like 2 children I've worked with very recently, just by increasing their fats, help them overcome constipation. And again, sort of pushes more towards a high fat or keto diet. Ensuring they're getting sufficient fluid and proper amounts of fiber. Again, not too much, not too little, and the right type of fiber. The second step is determining what the underlying cause is of the constipation. And often what's recommended is stool testing, checking for food intolerances, and certainly healing the gut. By doing so, it can take still several months, but often you can reverse the constipation so they're digesting, absorbing, and eliminating really nicely. And I have a constipation program. If you're interested, then you can contact me.